Good evening. Thanks everyone for joining us for our first candidate interview here at HULI. Our first candidate is Colehour Bondera, who's running for County Council District 6 in the southwest corner of the island. Thanks for stepping up to run. It's very important for our democracy is going to stay functional that we have candidates that are willing to throw their energy into a race and do their best job. Would you please introduce yourself briefly to our viewers?
Sure. Aloha. My name's Colehour Bondera, and I am running to be candidate in County Council District 6. You know, it goes from South Kona all the way to into Volcano. I grew up on a small farm with a large family in Oregon, and on my family's organic farm in Honau now, we raised not just all our crops, but our son and daughter. Before that, my studies through graduate school at the University of California, Davis, and I worked internationally with the Rodale Institute and others. And that led me to serve on the National Organic Standards Board from 2011 to 16. And since then with the organization Beyond Pesticides. And I've recently also moved on as longtime president of the board of the Kona Coffee Farmers Association. This last year, I also completed and graduated from a virtual 4-month session with the Kuleana Academy. So I just want to say that, you know, my experience in education, I know that people better meet their needs with community-based input. And that includes agricultural information and production sharing connections, reaching out through local formal organizations, informal organizations, public-private schools, including Kamehameha schools, churches, governmental programs at the county, state, national, and global levels. And I think District 6 provides priorities to us about local food reliance, about housing, education, transportation, public health and safety, community networks. And in my opinion, it really can be a good example through local community outreach and support for regenerative agricultural systems. We can strive to eat from community production through regional food hubs. But what is needed is to ensure that all the community members are represented, which is why community talk stories make sense to me. And really finally, as you know, carbon footprint issues are a significant aspect of how we can progress. The fact that the county is now in the process to secure electric, hydrogen, and updated buses suggests that we can hope for a future decision-making that is strongly influenced by looking out for long-term impact of choices we're making. Be those choices about the āina, about agriculture, transportation, et cetera. It all must be done in a progressive and a connected manner. I really want to thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you. You didn't even get the little clock. You made it under the wire. Good work. Yeah, I'm really happy to hear all this emphasis on agriculture. I think that's a huge potential for the future of our island here. So I'm sure you're aware, but this interview is being recorded so individuals can watch it live or later on demand so that they can hear all of your views on what are some very good questions. It's been mentioned to you already, but I'm not sure the audience is really aware of it, that a clock will appear on the upper left-hand corner of your screen when you have 30 seconds left in your answer for questions. So all your answers, you should be shooting for 3 minutes or less. So you'll see the little clock up there, you know you've got 30 seconds left. Kara, our two interviewers today are also involved in agriculture. So we're hitting this very well with Alexia Akbe and Evan Lamb. Alexia involved in, I guess you'd call it livestock maintenance and creating new paradigms there. And Evan in composting and various aspects in that way of soil fertilization. So we should be hearing a lot about livestock here today. So we've got a lot of questions to get through, and I'm going to turn it over to our interviewers. And I'm not sure what order you guys have arranged, but you can take it off now.
Thanks, Phil, and thank you for Colehour for that wonderful intro. We're going to kick it off, and you highlighted some of these previously, but our first question is, how have you advocated for your community or your district, and what community projects have you worked on in the past?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think it's a good historical reference point. And thinking about the current reality, but then you say the past. So I think I'll have to start with the moment, which, but through my work with Kona Coffee Farmers Association, and a lot of my neighbors and immediate community are coffee farmers, I've really found that at all the levels, at the county level and at the state level, and actually internationally, nationally and internationally, we need to speak up for accurate representation of what coffee is and what's in the bags. Especially mislabeled coffee has been a huge detriment to farmers in terms of income. And I think that, I've continued to testify to the legislature. I testified to the county on the current pieces of legislation that are about coffee labeling, but also are about subsidization to some of the coffee farmers for some of the inputs that people want to use. At the same time, I strongly feel, to get into the future, not just from the present, but that what we're facing is, our new pest and disease issues that people are talking about, which in this case is coffee leaf rust. With coffee, people want to talk about the fact that all we need to do is external inputs and fungicides and things like that. And honestly, there is no answer for that particular problem, but I have been strongly advocating through the organization that I'm affiliated with, but also through PBARC, and actually legislators through Senator Kanuha and Senator Ocasio, and House representatives as well, Capella and Lowen, that what we really need to focus on is how we can be doing things that are coming more from the local circumstance. So how we can be fighting this pest problem, but with local inputs and local strength. And the truth is, from an agricultural perspective, is that what we need to look at is tree health. And how are we going to focus on tree health without imported chemical fertilizers and without the fungicides? We can focus on other aspects. We can focus on Hawaii developed fertilizers that are coming straight here from Hawaii. We can focus on things like IMOs that are indigenous on every single farm and can fight back problems. And I correlate it with what we're all experiencing with COVID, and we're all humans, and everybody can't fight off COVID, just like coffee trees can't fight off coffee leaf rust. However, if you're stronger and healthier and focus on yourself first and start with your own, then you're going to be better off. At the same time, to move on quickly, the other community issues are food hub pilot issues that affect us. I think that even at the state level, the local food purchase stuff. So I think that there's other things going on that, in my opinion, have gotten some attention from me, but I want to wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for articulating that. Well, you'll have space in this next question to answer those. So what do you see are the three most pressing issues in your district?
Well, thank you for that question, but I think it's an interesting question because I don't necessarily want to address that from my perspective as a farmer or my perspective as somebody strongly involved in coffee issues, as much as I want to think about how we as a community can recognize that there are things that are affecting all of the community members. And I honestly think that transportation and housing are huge aspects of how people are functionally affected. And I think that you said the top three, and I don't know if I can readily identify a third one comfortably, but I think that generally speaking, public health and safety, I think, is vital. To be more specific, I think that, frankly, people don't use our public bus service very much. Why? Because it's not very much there. My two children went to a public charter school and they had to use that service and they could never get home on it because it was hours and hours of waiting after school, for example, because the bus doesn't go very often and it's not very reliable. And I think that that needs to be fixed in a lot of different ways. And one of the ways is having more buses, but one of the ways is having more bus service, for example. And I think that, the same kind of thing applies to education, even though, at the county level, it's hard to affect the state-run education system. I think that we need to be voicing that the educational structure doesn't meet the needs of all of the people that are living throughout, especially District 6. And I think that that's, in my opinion, a critical component of how we're dealing with things. And I think from a public health and safety perspective, I think that what I mentioned in the previous question, I think resonates completely with it. We don't need to be importing agricultural inputs that are chemical based, that are having a huge carbon footprint, excuse me, but more so, Hawaii already has the things that we need. It's just none of the research money, none of the effort, none of the energy is going towards Hawaii taking care of its own, not just agricultural needs, but land use needs and protection needs. Instead, we're getting federal money and subsidizing these things through inputs from outside of Hawaii. And I think we need to move beyond that, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks. You touched on affordable housing in general. Our next question is, what is your answer to the inefficient affordable housing currently on Hawai'i Island and that growing problem?
No, thank you for that question about housing. I think it's a very complicated question, and I wish that I could say that I want to be careful to not say this is the answer, but I think that the first things that come to my mind regarding affordable housing and availability is that there just isn't very much of it. And so does that mean talking to landowners and working with people to make sure that if there was money to develop some affordable housing, that it has a place to be? I think that is the first step, getting owners to be identified and willing to participate. And I think that the next step is the commitment, from the state and the county to, follow through. So I think that it can be a catch-22 because the landowners aren't going to come forth and say, here's this, if there's no program. And so I think that's why I hesitated at the beginning, because I don't have a concrete answer to how to achieve, but I think that it wouldn't be hard to come up with numbers of the minimum number of affordable housing units we need. There's, currently, like, I read something recently, 1,000 units going in up north here, not in my district, but up near the resorts. For the workers don't have housing. There's plenty of people like where I live that come up 40 plus miles from Ocean View because they can't afford housing up in this area because there is no housing accessible to people. So I don't have a exact number of how many, but I also know that affordable housing isn't only about workers, it's also about the senior population, and we're all aging, and people can't afford to pay for the housing market rents that exist, and the senior housing that exists is extraordinarily minimal, and it's not very well distributed. We don't have it in locations that we need to have it where people are already, that's where their lives are. And so I think that we need to figure out how to spread it out and how to get it accessible. And I would not say that it should be at all impossible to identify property owners that would be willing to participate. I would say it's not going to be, but it's a question of who's funding that and where's the funding coming from first. So I think that they have to happen simultaneously. And I think that it needs to be a significant emphasis in what's happening especially in my district, but I would say in this whole county. I think that it's a notable drawback for people having places like I mentioned, up near the resorts, which is up north. There isn't affordable housing for the workers very well distributed because it gets all gobbled up. And I think we need to take responsibility for that by providing what is necessary. Thank you.
All right. So next question, what do you see as the most pressing issues facing Native Hawaiians on Hawai'i Island, and how would you propose tackling some of those?
Thank you for that question. I think that that's an excellent question. And I think that I will just, I'm not sure what the right word is, but I will just tell you honestly that I would speak very inappropriately if I could say that I was saying these are the most pressing issues. I don't think that I can have that voice honestly without first having some talk stories with Hawaiian groups, a variety of Native Hawaiian groups, to make sure that I'm representing what they would prioritize. However, my perception is that education is a big component of what's happening with Native Hawaiians not having access to the whole range of educational needs that they need. And I think that honestly, the other truth that I would argue is that I mean, it's kind of a bad example, but I think that I can associate it with your question, because I think that the linkages between the communities is not very direct. So for example, I grow dryland taro on my farm, but the connections between individuals that consume dryland taro and my production are not very well meshed. And I'm not going to say that the Native Hawaiian groups would say, you know, all of these things are happening, but the pieces aren't put together. But that's my perception, is that the population that purchases from me that dryland taro is primarily Native Hawaiians, but it's not. The reason I'm bringing it up is because it's not very many Native Hawaiians who come to the farmer's market where I sell that. And so those pieces aren't put together very well, because most of the Native Hawaiians are like, you know, I don't go to that market. You know, I wouldn't do that. Why would I do that? You know, they're catering to tourists. They have things that other people want. And so I think that the tourism industry has significant drawbacks for Native Hawaiians. But I think that the other thing that jumps to mind more strongly in this is really land rights and land use decisions that are being driven by others besides the Native Hawaiian groups. I think that that's what I perceive to be a significant factor of who's making decisions and how they're being made, is related to land and property issues. And so I think that those are things that come to my mind, but I don't feel, like I said at the beginning, like I am adequately capable to feel like I'm giving the best answer without my first point would be, I would need to do some good talk stories before I felt like I was representing. Like, I don't feel like I can adequately represent. But thank you. I hope I addressed.
Thanks, Colehour. And speaking of land rights, I think our next question is just a yes or no question. Telescopes, construction sites, and commercial activities in many areas of Hawai'i Island have been carried out in zones areas zoned conservation. Do you believe these special use permits are hindering our capacity to preserve the āina?
Do I believe that the special use permits are hindering? Is that the question? The answer to the question is yes. And I don't know if I want to carry on about the fact that I think that that doesn't mean that there shouldn't and doesn't need to be discussion about, you know, special use permits aren't irrelevant automatically just because they cause problems. That doesn't mean that they aren't what you need to end up doing. So I don't have, you know, the proper answer for, does that therefore should they never be happening just because they have negative components. So it's going to be negative and positive balanced. And I think that the decision isn't going to always be in one direction or one way. But I think that I know that's a little bit of a fuzzy reply, but like you said, if it's yes, no, I would answer yes to the question, but I would say the caveat is that doesn't mean that we shouldn't recognize that there needs to be discussion.
Great,
on each one of those. Yeah.
Colehour, earlier you touched a little bit on the drawbacks of tourism. So how can we ensure that the tourism industry is in service to our working families rather than the other way around?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think it's exactly where we need to start thinking, which is, are we here for the tourists, or are the tourists here to visit us? And I think that, in my opinion, dependency on tourism is just like dependency on anything else. And I'm going to jump back and associate it with the fact that, you know, half of my farm, as a personal example, is Kona coffee. So do I tell everybody that that's all I do is Kona coffee? No. Kona coffee is one of my pieces. It's part of the situation. I don't just have a farm for the Kona coffee. I have a farm for its diversification. I have a farm for all of the parts. So I don't want to rely on one thing or have it be the only thing that's supporting my farm or making it work. And I think the same exact thing with tourism, both culturally and socially, but also from an economic perspective. I think the pandemic showed us all very clearly, and that we all learned that if we're going to rely on tourism and it stops, what are we all going to do? And so at the end of the day, maybe a lot of people were able to squeeze through with federal subsidy programs and federal support. But that doesn't mean that that's the answer or that that's the system that we want to be relying upon. I think a healthier system is a lot more diverse, and a healthier system, sure, tourism can be a component of it, and you might want it or you might not want it, but it doesn't need to be the decider. And I think that the way that Hawaii should be treating tourism is by the residents living and functioning, and the people who are tourists can come and visit that or not. And I think limited tourism may be, you know, one approach to that, in terms of, you know, there's a stopping point no matter what. You know, if we can't drive, if we can't, you know, go to our own stores, if we can't do our own things, then where do we want to cut it off? And where do we want to say enough is enough, because too much is too much? And I think that that's, in my opinion, where we're at with tourism, because it goes in spikes and downs and ups that make many people's lives very dysfunctional. And I think that we should be the deciders about that. The tourists shouldn't be the deciders about that. And I think it's very interesting right now with the fact that even a lot of people who want to be tourists to Hawaii, including even people I'm related to, are going to come and visit Hawaii because they can't imagine going, not imagine, but they don't, international travel is too questionable. And so Hawaii is safer and more secure because it's part of the United States. And it's like, I think that having strong and healthy limits identified makes a lot of sense, but having a lot less reliance on tourism is vital for both the tourism industry, but also for the community and the economy and the whole deeper permanent realities to be successful and function. I think that we have to take the lead on tourism rather than let it take us.
Thanks. And I'm going to ask a follow-up to that question too, Colehour. What non-tourism economic opportunities are you most excited about on Hawai'i Island right now?
Okay, I think that that's a very interesting question. I hadn't necessarily contemplated the non-tourism economic approach, but I don't think it's very hard, because I think that Hawaii, for example, and I'm not going to give you an exact number of years, but it's not that long ago, used to be a net exporter of food with basically the same human population. And now we're importing 80+% of all of our food. Why? Not because we can't grow the food, but because diets change, but also because habits change and the costs involved change. And so why aren't we focused on producing and distributing our local food and eating it? I can't answer the why, except for, you know, I'm in an area where all the farms are very small, relatively speaking. And 5-acre farms, especially something like ours, a diversified 5-acre farm, you can't justify driving, you know, any distance to deliver a box of this or that. It's not financially viable. It's not possible. And so there aren't systems in place to make that work, because they're all structured for a different approach, which is historically how things have often functioned, which is, you have a place that brings it all together, and then they are the processing place or distribution place. And I think it's not geared around or working towards successful small operations. And I think that Hawaii could, like I said about, I gave 2 examples earlier about fertilizers and pest control options of things that exist here in Hawaii on the ground, on farms. And no focus is paid towards that at any of the levels, not by the University of Hawaii, either through their researchers or through CTAR, not through, Hawaii Department of Agriculture. None of the people think that there's any answer except for this agricultural system, which is top down and imports inputs. And I think that we could be, a specific example along those lines is the only fertilizer that I bring in my farm that I'm using on my farm is made out of Hawaii fish and biochar. So it's fish waste and biochar. That is the fertilizer. That's right here, Hawaii products. So why aren't we emphasizing that rather than continuing to get rid of a lot of the fish in Honolulu as they're processed and dumped back in the ocean, instead of making sure that we are creating a system which wouldn't be necessarily easy or necessarily save that much money, but what it would save is environmental impact, and it would keep the jobs in Hawaii. So if you put some value to those things, which is hard, those are 2 things that it's hard to value because people already have jobs in Hawaii distributing the imported fertilizer. So it's the same people doing a different job. And they already, environmental impact is hard to, it's not impossible, but it's harder to measure the costs of. And so those are things that are a lot easier to dismiss as not related. But I think that's but an example, but I think that people could be producing and doing most of our needs here at home rather than relying on imported things that we've all become so dependent on.
Thanks for that. So shifting gears a little bit into something that's tangentially related, which is energy. A question we had was, have you been following the Hūhonua bioenergy plant, and do you feel informed enough to stake out your present position on it?
So your general question is good. I almost want to reach over and grab some papers that I have sitting over there because I've read a little bit recently about it, but I haven't been following it closely enough that I'm super familiar with it is the response. When you say, have I been following it? So yes, but not strongly.
Okay.
So I'm aware of it.
Thank you. The next question we have is, again, changing up a little bit. Which marginalized communities do you consider yourself an advocate for, and what policies do you plan or different efforts do you plan on enacting to support those communities?
And I'm sorry to ask you to repeat the word, but the word in your question was advocate. Is that correct? Which communities am I an advocate for?
Which marginalized communities do you consider yourself an advocate for?
Okay, thank you. So I hesitate to answer that question from the past rather than the future, but as a political candidate, I would say that my heartfelt reality is to represent marginalized communities that I'm aware are not doing things like voting, for example, because they aren't participating in the structure or the system. And I would actually, it's not necessarily addressing the other question, but I think that it relates in terms of the fact that I don't think that a significant ratio, if you look at the who actually votes in elections, and the reason I'm hesitating is because the word marginalized community, but I think in some ways the Native Hawaiian communities are marginalized and don't participate in some of these processes because they are left out and they aren't included in the processes as they should be. And I think that what I'm pointing at is that it depends a little bit on what is the definition of the word marginalized, but I don't want to get into that because I don't think it's necessary. What I do think is necessary is to recognize that in different ways, different communities feel relatively marginalized, and their biggest way out is to not participate. And I think it's because they don't feel listened to, and they aren't sought to participate in conversations via means that make sense to them. I think that the Marshallese community, I think that all of the first language Spanish speaking communities that are pretty heavy in my district, and specifically where I am in South Kona in terms of workers, these people are not participating at all in any of these decision-making or processes. I think that honestly, a lot of, to look at it from a different perspective, even though what I said is not wrong, the poorer worker communities are really don't feel like they have a means to communicate with anybody on the ground or about what their needs are, because nobody's reaching out to them or trying to talk to them. And I think that the only place that can change is a little bit through schools, but most people aren't feeling through the educational system they can affect things, and a little bit through churches, but then that's very culturally specific, honestly. That there's different, groups go to different churches. And so the strategy that I would like to use is to try to seek people and means to tap into those marginalized communities so that they feel like their voice is being listened to, even if it's not readily translatable to action. Not, like I said, because those are the voters, because frankly, those are the groups of people that are marginal, partly because they don't have a means. They don't even bother voting because they don't feel like they're going to be heard or listened to. And I think that we need to figure out how, through talk story or participation in some of their community activities, that they would feel that we can all come together, which I think is part of my personal approach, which is if we can listen and talk to each other, then I'm not going to therefore be able to be your spokesperson, but I'll listen to your spokesperson and be respectful in that regard. And I think that that's honestly what we need to do across the board. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I addressed it.
Yeah, I guess following up on Native Hawaiian involvement in political processes, I have another question for you. What does Hawaiian sovereignty mean to you?
I think this is a very good question. Hawaiian sovereignty, I think, is a critical historical aspect of how Hawaiians get to decide and are deciding how things are moving forward and what has happened. And I think that historically we are missing out on the fact that taking something from Hawaiians doesn't mean that it's therefore decided that it's free form. And I think that Hawaiian sovereignty really, for me, means that this is Hawaii and the Native Hawaiians. This is not somebody else gets to decide what happens. And I think that, does that mean renouncing statehood? I think it could. And I think that's fine to recognize and move forward with. I'm not going to, again, like I responded earlier to, appropriately representing Native Hawaiian groups. I feel like I would, only feel comfortable doing that if that was something that was sought. And I think that I'd be willing to stand up with and not just listen to, but represent people, because I think that you have to base your decisions on the history that has formed where we're at. And I think that that's, for me, really where sovereignty doesn't mean isolation. Sovereignty means that that's who decides where things are at and what is happening. Sovereignty is, I get to make those decisions. I get to move things forward in a way that works for us, rather than I think that some of the perception sometimes is isolationism, and that I don't think that that's what any of the Hawaiians are ever talking about. And I don't think Hawaiian sovereignty leadership is focusing on isolationism, but in fact, instead it's focusing on taking control of our own needs and making decisions in ways that make sense for us, and being the ones that are the representatives.
Thanks for articulating that. So leading into that, one of the historical issues that we've had here on the Big Island is a drug addiction crisis, particularly the methamphetamine epidemic. So what kind of ideas do you have around implementing solutions to this problem?
Well, I think that's an excellent general question, and I will address it specifically, but I think it's a very good general question, and the fact that I'll just say the truth, which is most human beings are addicted, personality-wise. That is not specifically to a specific drug. It can be carried out in all kinds of different means. And I think that we all are looking for ways to change our reality or get out of where things are at. And I think that the fact that meth is so addictive and so problematic is something that we can react to and try to solve it where it's already in use. But I think that the more important strategy would be to create vibrant and healthy and functional communities and outlets and options so that people aren't seeking that kind of option in their choices. And I think that those things, when they're not in place, I'm not saying that crystal meth is only used by people who are bored and there's nothing else to do. Not at all. I think that instead it's available, and people know that they can get their hands on it and from availability. And I think that people are more likely to do something easy than something else. But I think that if you make other things available and other options, and I'm not saying take this drug instead of this drug, although it could be that way, but I'm saying is work with the communities to figure out what else can be put into place or made accessible or made available, so that path isn't gone down. In terms of the existing problem, which is really, I think, the focus of your question, which I kind of talked around a little bit, but I don't think that was my point. My answer is, I think that you have to have healthy and secure ways. Once somebody's addicted to meth, it's not a very comfortable or healthy thing to confront or address. And people are unintentionally doing things that are quite destructive. And so I think that we have to have community public health efforts to be able to work with those people and to be able to work with them so that they can get through their problems. And I think that those don't really exist. It's basically you're just taken away and put off on your own. And I think that that's not a community method to recognizing that, and then what, the person's just going to come back. That's not going to solve the issue. And I think we need to address it at the community level, but also address it more broadly as to how can the state and the county be more ahead of the game. Thank you.
Thank you, Colehour. Changing it up again, leading scientists have agreed that by the year 2030, we must have substantially reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. Some estimate a 50% reduction by 2030 in order for civilization as we know it to continue. While humanity continues to face age-old problems stemming from inequality and injustice, climate change is different from every other issue in that it poses an actual known deadline. Does the year 2030 hold any significance for you?
Thank you for that question. I think what jumps to mind in response is not related, so I'll hesitate to respond. But I think that I remember, you know, when there was a phrase in a book came out called 1999, and you know, I think that wasn't specifically, you know, related to global warming, but it's about change. And I think that these things happen, and you try to set a date, and I think that that's logical. But for heaven's sakes, we are all intelligent enough that we can and should recognize that, sure, if it's 2030, then let's set our time frame to 2025 just in case, so that we're really ready. Like, let's address these issues and deal with these changes and start them in place, because humans don't like change very much. To be honest and simple about it, no human really wants significant change. So you don't want change overnight. You don't want change instantaneously. That's why the pandemic has been such a problem for people, is because it's dramatic change, and people can't deal with dramatic change. Even frankly, wearing face masks in public, that drives, you know, a significant percentage of people insane. And I think identifying a date is important, but I think that the purpose and goal has to be, what can we change already to make that different? And I think, in my opinion, that's what we, as not just residents of my county district and not just residents of Hawaii, but human beings in general, have to start taking significant actions to change our behavior patterns. And those behavior patterns, I think, like I said at the end of my introduction, could be something as simple as public transportation. Let's stop using cars to go every single place individually, just because that's the habit and that's the pattern. Let's change that effective, you know, in 2023. That's what we're all doing, because the buses are going to be running every hour, for example. You know, they aren't, and it's not happening, but I think coming up with some solutions that are achievable and implementing them, I think, would be strategically logical, because I think that environmentally, you know, climate change impact, I don't think that there's any real way around that fact that it's very true, and 2030 is going to, I feel like, be the end rather than the beginning of the end.
Thanks for that. So one school of thought in responding to climate change is the zero waste movement, and within that, for Hawai'i Island, we can render green waste into beneficial agricultural products such as compost and mulch, and making it easily accessible through distributed facilities on the Big Island has been proposed. Would you help move forward a plan to expedite this process?
Thank you. Great question. I think that the answer to your question is yes, because I feel very strongly that that's very needed. I think that the distribution is the biggest problem for making use of the program, even though it's been more functionally in place in the last 7 to 10 years than it was before that. But I think that I have to add in the fact that I think that, even though I 100% agree that that's the approach, your question at the beginning was a little bit more general, which is waste. And I think that we need to recognize, you know, some of those other factors of waste, which include, frankly, transportation. You know, if we're going to be having big trucks be driving big loads of green waste so it gets delivered to big locations, well, then people like the 42 farms up my hill, you know, we don't have a road that will accommodate you know, those kind of things, for example, because we're all little farms and we have our own private road. And that actually, down here in South Kona, that's very, very common. You know, people couldn't deal with those issues. And so I think that even though it has a lot of promise, I think that the distribution structure needs to be multi levels and spread out in multi dimensions simultaneously to be useful across the board. And I think that using that kind of strategy, I think for accessibility, I think would be amazing. And we have all of those products already. We have all of that waste happening. Like I mentioned previously about the waste products of fish, getting dumped back in the ocean when they're processed in Honolulu, rather than being made into fertilizer and be, used in Hawaii. And so I think that, it depends on how you see which thing is waste, like I was saying at the beginning, not earlier. Green waste is one component, but there's a lot of other waste things that are going on. And just to wrap up, one of them is all the things we're importing, and many of the things we're importing are plastics, and plastics you can't really do anything about except for just have a big old island out in the ocean. So we need to figure out more broadly how to stop creating the level of waste that we're creating as well, even though that's not specifically about the green waste. Thank you.
Thanks, Colehour. I think that's a wrap for us today. Phil, any closing comments here? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was impressed with your giving specific answers in those instances where you had, some concrete information. And that's what we need to focus on, finding detailed answers for things that can be done, not, I guess, what you call pie in the sky. But thank you for that.
Thanks. Okay.
No, thank you all for your time and attention. And thanks to everybody out there watching. Aloha.